When Malcolm got to Ghana, he reached out to Vicky, want to start a revolution, see Vicky Garvin and Maya Angelou, and they were the ones who set up all of Malcolm's diplomatic contacts with Cuba, Algeria, and all the because they knew all the revolutionaries. If you look at Malcolm X's, that section is pretty thick in his autobiography. They even had a state dinner by the Chinese communists given to him in the capital of Ghana, given by Wan Hua, who is the ambassador to Ghana. Wan Hua has just published his memoirs lately because he's retired. Wan Hua was part of the Long March in the Chinese Revolution. He was one of the few Chinese delegates at the Bandung Conference that was a turning point in anti-colonialism. And they stationed him in Africa for strategic reasons. Okay? So Vicky was the tutor of Wan Hua's children, teaching them English. Well, that was the cover story. So she was in touch with them, and so they set up that state dinner that launches Malcolm X. Then Malcolm goes back to the United States. He comes back to Africa one more time before he's assassinated. Malcolm's in Egypt and Vicky Garvin's in Egypt. Vicky Garvin's in Egypt on the way to China to work with Mao Zedong in China and be part of the Cultural Revolution. Du Bois had set that up before he died. And Malcolm's on the way to the Cairo conference to talk to the African heads of states. And he's poisoned, sad to say, at that meeting in Cairo. But anyway, Vicky and Malcolm meet that last time after all these years together. And Vicky says, Malcolm, why don't you come with me, man? This is a chance of opportunity. I'm going to see what they're doing in China. You know, I've been working on the socialist experiment in Ghana. And now I want to see what they're doing in China, and then I'll have an overview, because she was interested in comparative revolution, which is the intellectual side of what they're doing. And Malcolm says very prophetically, I'm not going to make it. All right? He says, but I want you to go and learn everything that you can learn, but do this one thing for me. Make sure you come back. Don't just go over there. And you have to teach the next generation all the lessons you've learned in Africa and in China, how we make revolution, and compare that to how we're making revolution. So that's the project they were working on together, and you know what happened to Malcolm X. What happened to Vicky Garvin is she stays, and she's in the middle of the Chinese Cultural Revolution for 6 years. There's only 4 black people, or African Americans, I'm sorry, in China during this period of time. There's Robert Williams, same self-defense Robert Williams, who was in Cuba, then goes to Africa. Mabel Williams, his wife, and some brother who got shot down in North Korea, I think, and ended up staying there. And they would get together and cook soul food on the weekend and try to stay African American, basically. And from Vicky, so I'll jump to the story. So then what happens is Vicky Garvin, after I was so dumb and didn't know who Vicky Garvin was, she shows up at my door about a year later. I was living with a guy named Harry Haywood, who's written a book called Black Bolshevik. And Harry was living in Mexico, and we were playing cards in Chicago. He decided to come live with me in Newark. I'll just make a long story short. And I was his research assistant. And I guess I was so dumb, he had to get a team of tutors to come teach me the history of the revolutionary movement. And Vicky was the heavy-duty teacher who came in. And so in my dining room, they told me the history of the movement. And now they had a drink. Oh, you recording this? Well, I guess I can say this already. They would drink Jack Daniels. I don't know that you had to be a drink Jack Daniels to be a communist. And I couldn't drink it. I drink beer. And halfway through the bottle, Vicky would get up and act out these stories for me. So I was like a children's play. I was learning the history of the movement. She'd act out the meeting she was in and all that stuff like that. And I learned I thought that, you know, it was an old woman telling me these stories. But everything she told me, it turned out to be not only true, but usually an understatement about her role in it. So I went out and found this document from a 1950s black labor movement. A guy named Bill Hood gave this famous speech that's in all the documentaries on black labor history in 1951. So I said, hey, I really love this. So I'm going to go take this back and show Vicky my homework. So I get to my dining room and I read the first sentence, and she recited the rest of the speech to me. I said, my goodness, you read that too? She said, no, I wrote that. I said, now wait a minute, Vicky, I got the book right here. It says Bill Hood's right behind this thing. She said, yeah, well, that's true. He gave a speech. He was supposed to give the keynote speech. He got drunk the night before. I wrote the speech. He became famous. So from that point on, when I went into became a scholar, I always tried to figure out the difference between who made the speech and who wrote the speech. And when I had my course called Women in the Black Revolt, we did a lot of Katrina work, and we'd see that the women who organized the programs, on the day of the programs, would be on the side directing it and might not be on stage. So I taught them a method that many of these women, if their role is to be invisible, right? If they're teaching self-emancipation, they want the people they put on stage to run the show. But just if you go to a Broadway show, you know the actor on stage didn't write the play. So the metaphor we started using is they're the composers, the writers, and the directors. They may not always be on stage. And Vicki explained to me, she told me about basically Sears and Roebuck and all these companies. The only job a black woman could get in the company was to clean the toilets and be a servant in the place. So they had to fight for the right to be exploited like other people on the shop floor, right? And they want to struggle in 23 plants for Sears and Roebuck. But if you look at the document, it's signed by the Urban League. So I said, well, Vicki, if you want all these struggles, why is the Urban League's name on there? She said, so we wouldn't have our hands tied to call a wildcat strike for the next time when they did something wrong. So their very organizing strategy often made them invisible in historical record. So if we do this kind of history, we have to know how to look for it and that they want to be invisible. And that might be why Vicki lived to be almost 100 years old. So there's some wisdom. I mean, there's a debate among us scholars about whether this is being a subordinate role. But in my opinion, you know, and I might be biased because she was my coach in a lot of strategies, but when we went to the National Black United Front, Vicki rented a hotel room in Brooklyn, downtown Brooklyn. We had the conference. And when we had 1,000 delegates there, and there was a big fight over the women question, women's equality in one of those workshops. And we could not pull this thing together. So all these people come from all over the country, and they were gonna leave that night. So Jalea, the woman I was working with, we went to Vicki's room, and Vicki got a piece of paper and laid out a strategy of who to put in the room together and how to negotiate it in the back room and to bring it back online. And that's what happened. Now, Reverend Daughtry, who ended up chairing, he's the House of Lord Church minister, didn't know that this has happened in Vicki's room. So it wasn't until, and Vicki was a member of his church. So at the memorial, there was a big debate when I was giving the memorial speech at her, when she died, whether I should reveal, I'm going to tell, the young people who led this thing. And Reverend Daughtry and his wife said, well, we thought she was just a little old lady. And she was the one who suggested that we have a sisterhood with the women in South Africa. She would never use her position in her history to win a point. She would just be another person in the room offering ideas and have the best idea, but she would never say, I was with Malcolm X, I was with Paul Robeson, I was with Du Bois. She would just say, well, I have an idea. Why don't we work with the sisters in South Africa? And the women never knew that she was any, and that's probably why she didn't get busted in prison. And I think there is some wisdom there. I'm not saying it's the only strategy, but it's one that let her die in an old age home instead of in prison. So there is some merit to that. But so I think many of these women are what we wanted to get at in the beginning was to change the narrative. But we started to realize that they were intellectual leaders, they were strategic leaders, they had fashion strategies, and that the very definition of radicalism had to be enriched by the complicated layers of struggles that they were involved in. Right? If we had an a priori or before the fact definition of what radicalism was, that if we started with these women and then make it, what do you call it, a posteriori, after the fact, right? Which history should be that anyway, it's after the fact, right? Look at what they did. She's 90 years revolutionary. She ended up being just as old as Du Bois, actually. You know, in terms of that, right? And, oh, this is great. She has a video. I wish I could have brought the video with me. She's interviewed at the nursing home, and she's 90-something years old. And she gives a long thing about that last meeting she had with Malcolm X. She says, I just want all of the young comrades to know I'm still struggling from the senior citizens home here. So I'm writing letters to people and stuff like that. So she still had the fire in the belly. It was quite beautiful. But she was my teacher. And I felt that she wasn't my only woman teacher. I just felt that some of us, and many of us young men, so when she came back in the United States, she educated people like me. Just like Malcolm said. And then there were other young men who got up and testified that she had been their teacher. She sat down. And, you know, a lot of times we're looking for a revolutionary school or theater or something like that. But what these women explained to me, sometimes it's your car, it's your living room, it's one-on-one, coaching you through a situation so you learn how to handle yourself in a difficult tactical situation. That's what they would do. It's on-the-job kind of training or an apprenticeship that you're going through. And she wasn't one of these like abstract theory person. It was like strategy on the ground, because the strategic thinking had to change as the situation is changing. And so she would actually come to you at the conference. She wouldn't be on the floor, but she like a little chess game and lay it out for you. And every time we did it, we won and stuff like that. So I thought it would be a betrayal. And I do think it's a betrayal for many of the men who are writing this history to now that it's a really negative form of plagiarism. You see what I'm saying? We were off the record. These women told us these things. Now I could try to be famous if I quoted everything Vicki Garvin said and said I came up with it. I could be famous with that stuff, right? But you know. And maybe if you see me do that, you'll see, just call Komozi an opportunist. And he joined the band with everybody else, right? He's in Hollywood now. But many people who are doing this are plagiarizing the ideas of these revolutionary women and putting their name in there instead. But we learned, hey, I joined the movement because of Faneuil Hamer. I'm not ashamed of that. You know what I mean? I saw Faneuil Hamer when I was 15 years old. I'm in school. They tell me Faneuil Hamer was raped and tortured in prison, beaten by a black man who was the strongest prisoner there. Under the, you know, they either shoot you or you beat Faneuil Hamer. And she forgave him. And I said, you know, well, I'm 50. I said, well, what am I doing for my freedom? If she's going to do all that, I'm like sitting here like a bump on a log. What am I doing for my own freedom? So I joined her organization, which was Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that's where many of us, and the reason I know the history of many movements, the women would sit me down at dinner, and they must have known what they were doing. They would tell me the history of what happened on the West Coast, what happened in these various places, so I would know the lore. And so now it's time for us to write it down so it can be in our children's textbooks, so they can know what their grandmothers did. It's, I'll tell this last story, and then I guess I should, in Mississippi, there's an awful book called Mississippi Burning. Yeah. There's a movie called Mississippi Burning. Yeah. And there was an outcry in the state of Mississippi from black women from all over Mississippi had rallies screaming against that film because it took away the history that they had given to their children and said the FBI protected them. Right? They said we don't have oil, we don't have gold, the only resource we have is our history. So I've been very sensitive that, you know, it seems like, oh, it's history. But, you know, it comes down to this big question, who owns history? And these women are part of the thing that claiming we own history. And, you know, think about what's going on today in the world. There's revolution in the air. There's an interesting thing about revolution. Revolution, that's not being said about revolution. Revolution happens when people feel entitled to that. Right? They feel, I'm entitled to a better leadership. I'm entitled to a better life. My kids are entitled to a better school. We're going to fight this. You have to have that sense of entitlement. Where do you get that entitlement from? It's a historical claim. You see what I'm saying? You have to have history. So let me read you a history. Let me read you a definition of black people where you'll see why the movement had to redo this history. This is a 1903 definition of Negro that you can find if you look at, so in a book, I don't know if I remember the name of the book, but anyway, oh yes, in the book by Jack Bloom called Class, Race, and Civil Rights Movement on page 45 if you're so inclined. But my students were good. They actually went to the library and got the encyclopedias from this time. So 1903, it's also in 1913. Now in here, 1903, they define Negro. If you look in the 1913 edition, they have Negro and then they have Negrillo. Little Negro, right after that. Okay. So it didn't get any better as time went on. So the definition of Negro is this. Weight of brain as indicating cranial capacity, 35 ounces. In parent. Highest gorilla, 20. Average European, 45. Thick skin, emitting a peculiarly rancid odor compared to that of a buck goat. This is not the Klan, this is the Encyclopedia Britannica. So imagine a little girl in 1903 who gets called nigger and says, you know, that's an ignorant person. Let me go to the encyclopedia and figure out who I am. So she looks at this. Cranial sutures which close much earlier in the Negro than other races. It is this premature ossification of the skull. This is behind a lot of this IQ research they do on races here, right? And they do the same thing with women too. Premature ossification of the skull preventing all further development of the brain. Many pathologists have attributed the inherent mental inferiority of blacks and an inferiority which is even more marked than their physical difference. So they're saying that basically you're dumber than you're uglier, right? Nearly all observers admit that the Negro child is on the whole quite as intelligent as those of other varieties, but that upon arriving at puberty, sex is in the air, all further development is arrested. The Negro child on plantations was sharp, intelligent, and full of life. But upon approaching the adult period, a gradual change sets in. The intellect seems to become clouded. I'm getting dizzy just reading this. We must necessarily suppose that the development of the Negro and white proceeds on different lines. Apartheid. It is more, now you gotta brace yourself with it. It is more correct to say that the Negro, that he is non-moral than immoral. Now you don't have to question why so many people in jail happen to be black when you come up with criminology and things like that, right? Because think about the implication of that. Like a dog may not have morality. Well, even dogs sometimes, right? But they're saying, okay, but more non-moral than immoral. This is Encyclopedia Britannica saying this, right? All social institutions are at the same low level and seem to have no perceptible advance except under stimulus from foreign influence. White people. Slavery continues everywhere to prevail. The arts are exclusively of an industrial character and restricted mainly to coarse weaving, pottery, smelting, and the working of metals, agriculture, and growing. And here's the kicker. No full-blooded Negro has ever been distinguished as a man of science, a poet, or an artist. And the fundamental equality claimed for him by ignorant philanthropists is belied by the whole history of the race, and then they doubled it up throughout the historic period. So, that's why a lot of these activists, you see the first thing they do is form a Black History Club, And they want to know because they've been confronted. They're sitting, in California, still some of the textbooks still have pickaninnies in a textbook in California, in the public high schools and stuff like that. So we're still bedeviled by this, and basically, if you want to read more of this definition summarizes a century of scientific racism, so-called scientific racism. So you can find, matter of fact, you could get a PhD in the 19th century in a field called niggerology. Right? Look in a book by George Fredrickson called The Black Image and White Mind, and he rehearses a lot of this. He goes from 1817 to 1914. I don't know why he stopped there, right? Because, but so all of these people were running. So you're doing the intellectual work, but then you had to actually prove it, right? So when I went to school, as late as 1967, it seemed like a long time ago. My freshman year in college, I got the only F I've ever had in my career in a music class. When the teacher was teaching music, he got the folk music. So I raised my hand. I said, Mr. Posey, does that mean you're going to talk about blues and jazz? He said, young man, you're in college. Blues and jazz is not music. And then he proceeded to give me an F in the course. So I learned something. I said, well, wow, I wonder why that must have been important to him. That must have been important to him. And when I went to graduate school, when I tried to go to graduate school to Princeton the first time, they brought me to Princeton and offered me a full fellowship, and they toured me around and they would give me all this money to go to school. And then the guy stopped me and said, we're going to make you famous. It was 1971. He said, we're just introducing computers to the field of politics, and we got a special project just for you. So I said, now wait a minute. I come to graduate school so I could choose my own topic and, stuff like that. He said, no, we want you to investigate and quantify why Negroes always lose. I said, come again? He said, you put the same thing. So I knew him. So I said, I tried to be as diplomatic as I could because I needed the money. I said, well, that is an impressive question for you. But I actually have something else to work on here. He said, no, that's the deal. That's the only reason we're going to give you this money. We want you to basically be the front for this question. And so I had to turn it down. And I went back and won some elections. That's why I did all the electoral politics. It seems minor now that we won. But if you go back to 1970, there were many black people, we go back a couple years with the issue of president, who thought they couldn't win. That they really believed the myth that they couldn't organize themselves and win these contests. And as long as you don't think you could win in democracy, it's hard to talk about winning for socialism. Right? So after we won some of the elections, then we could raise issues of socialism, right? Because now the racial barrier is over. It's not that, so what's happening with the economy? Right? But as long as people say, well, I can't win anything, or I'm not entitled to win. You know that? That's the other piece. See, part of when we're having a hard time organizing people, you try to do a rent strike or something like that, or a tenant strike. Some people don't think they deserve a better housing situation. Right? So if you're faced with that, and that's why we had the anti-imperialist culture union and groups like that, to have art that identified you as a deserving person. Right? And when we talk about all these women who struggle around the schools, first you have to believe your child deserves a better education than that. Right? You got kids going to school in New York City in a toilet. It's a book called Savage Inequality goes into that. They run out of classroom, they got children go to school in the bathroom. Right? So if you find people not struggling in a situation, they have been demoralized by that, right? So one of the first things we have to do with our political work, whether it's history or art or culture or music, whatever we use, spiritual, whatever it is, that you deserve better than that. One of the first black women revolutionaries, we found this woman from 1740, I think. Her name is Rebecca. African woman, brought over in the Caribbean, made a slave. She becomes one of the first Christian Protestants. And she invents, there's a book called Black International that goes in this, and I'll tell the story and I'll wrap up. So they tell her the whole Christian thing, and she gets in trouble because she interprets it. She says, oh yeah, I get it. Because they had said slavery, you're a slave because you're cursed. God hates you. Right? And so she looked at it and said, well, no. She started teaching another thing. She got all these women together and said, Jesus loves you. That's the first thing. So you're not cursed. Jesus loves you. And two, he wants you to break your chains. So they put her on trial. Said they would, she said, hey, you could burn me to hell, but I'm not going to go to hell telling a lie. Number one, Jesus loves them. And two, he wants them to break their chains. So they try to get her out of there. And that's one of the revolutionary contents of the black church is it's organized around those things there. People don't understand why the spirituals can be so subversive, but it's telling you in a world where they got a definition of Negro in 1903 saying this, you know what they were saying in 1803, right? In that context, it's not a conservative message to say that God loves you, right? And that he wouldn't want you to be whipped like that last night. He wouldn't want your mother to be raped like that last night, right? That you are entitled not to have your child sold down to Mississippi, right? Because one of the things slave masters trying to say, hey, that's not your baby, that's a commodity. I own that. These women were the first thing to say, no, that's kinship. It's not a commodity. I'm going to fight you over that. That's revolutionary. They didn't have a printing press. All they had with their hand to grab that child and fight that battle and say, this is a family, this is not a transaction. Right? So these are the revolutionary embers that these women have been cultivating all this time. And that's why we thought we should do a book on women's revolutionary role. And so this is part of a larger project we've been working on. We've got Erica Huggins in here with the Black Panther Community School. A lot of things you see in this cross what you think of as racial. Yuri Kuchiyama, the Japanese activist you see here, was working with Malcolm X. She was a member of Malcolm X's organization before. Matter of fact, Vicky Garvin and Yuri Kuchiyama used to show up at all the socialist meetings together and mentored our generation. Yuri must be 90 this year. She was incarcerated in the Japanese internment camps and then joined the Black Liberation Movement. You got Denise Oliver, who was in the Black Panther Party, led the Young Lords. People thought she was Puerto Rican. Right? So you got white women who were in the women's movement who were going to the Black Power conferences. All of that, and Flo Kennedy's chapter goes into that. So there's a lot more internationalism going on, even when the label was nationalism, than we thought. And that's what you kind of see. That's what, first we're going to say black women in the freedom struggle. Then we realized it wasn't just black women. It was all these women had joined. And there's a long history of that. So I hope I haven't messed up all the time here, but you can probably ask me something about the questionable stuff I've been telling you tonight. And this question and answer period. But thank you for coming out tonight.